textbook.
That's like the textbook, but that's great. Well done.
Should we go?
Let's do this. How are we doing this? Very good, yeah.
So, well, welcome everybody. So we are super happy to have David Stadelmann today with us. So David is a professor in the University of Bayreuth. He has authored so many publications and very nice papers. So he has also been awarded with a very prestigious prize, the Reinhard Selten Prize, awarded by the German Economic Association. He's an editor of Kiklos, a very nice journal that is improving in the rankings very fast. Today he's going to talk about more federal legislators lead to more resources for the constituencies, evident from exogenous differences in seat allocations. So just as a reminder, so it's, we are in this new rule, so 15 minutes for the presenter, and then we go for the discussion, okay? If I don't remember your name, please, it's just my type, it's my problem, so sorry about that. I will point you, and please accept my apologies in advance. I will be keeping the queue. Okay, David, thank you very much for being here.
Thank you very much. It's a true pleasure for me to be here. Gustavo and I, we are working quite successfully together, I think, on at least 3 different projects. But it's a great honor also to present our paper together with Marco Franca, who is one of my collaborators here at the workshop, and I'm really looking forward to your inputs and questions, of course. What I will do in the next roughly 10 minutes, so I don't need 15 minutes, I will give you a brief sketch again of what we are doing. So we are actually interested in this project, and also in numerous other projects, of more broadly how politicians behave towards their constituents. In this project we are particularly interested in the causal identification of the effects of the number of legislators on resource allocation at district level. So we want to know whether more legislators are also able to get more resources for their respective districts. Thereby we link to a relatively large literature on common pool resources, more precisely on the so-called law of 1/n, with the idea that there is a common pool of resources at the federal level. And then if you are an active legislator, or if you have more legislators and you try to get these resources, there are some marginal costs for you, okay, for your district. There are some costs, but these costs are just 1/n because the total pool is there, and the more you get for your people, the better it is. But of course, we are then suffering from the common problem of the commons. Okay, so we are not precisely contributing to how this can be solved. We want to show first whether this is really the case and that it's something relevant. We look at a specific institutional setting where we think that this causal identification is really working quite well. And we look at the German mixed electoral system, so at the German Bundestag. And there the interesting element that we have realized and that we are exploiting in our empirical setting is that district magnitude actually varies exogenously. I will soon explain that. And it's hopefully also quite well explained already in the paper, but if you don't think so, then we will have to improve that further. District magnitude can vary from 1 to 5 legislators in our data set, so it's a relatively small number of legislators that we are looking at, which is a nice thing because there's a lot of literature in political science, also in political economy, that there may be non-linearities in political representation depending on the number of legislators that you have. We will not suffer from them, or at least not to a large extent. Our main result will be that there is a positive effect on the number of legislators, on the number of federal civil servants that you have per constituency. So more legislators in the German context bring you more civil servants for the respective constituency. These can be police officers, military personnel, judges, etc., etc. And actually, you can give very precise estimates. So one additional legislator gives you roughly 35 more federal public servants per constituency and per legislative period. And actually, when you look at more qualitative literature, and when you look also at the websites of these legislators, the 35 number corresponds quite precisely to what they claim that they are doing. So they are making, well, advertisements or even commercials that they have done successfully. What's the institutional background? So we leveraged the German mixed electoral system, which is a combination of a majoritarian system with plurality and a proportional system. So a typical mixed electoral system, which is quite often referred to in the literature, and well, some authors may have gotten inspiration from Germany. In the system, voters have two votes. The first vote is for a direct candidate in the constituency. So one direct representative is elected within the constituency by plurality. The second vote is, in Germany they say, more decisive vote, and you give it to a party list at the state level. Okay? So you elect list candidates, and these list candidates can then enter the Bundestag, federal parliament, by proportional rule. The second vote determines the number of seats that the party receives in the end. There are numerous subtleties, of course. For example, you need to have at least 5% of votes so that you can participate in the allocation of proportional rule. The overall system does try to achieve proportionality, okay, under the numerous subtleties that we have. But now the interesting thing is, candidates can run simultaneously for the direct here, so can be direct candidates, and at the same time have a place on the party list. So what may happen is that you have two candidates running against each other in a certain district, okay? One will be elected directly, but the other one has also a relatively safe place on the party list, and he will also enter federal parliament. But then, to a certain extent, he will be also representing his constituency, because probably the next time, the next election, he will be competing again as a direct candidate. So there are incentives also for candidates that did not win the direct election to take care, to some extent at least, of their constituency. And the thing is, we don't know in advance whether you will make it to parliament. So this is the exogenous variation that we are going to explore. You can have either one competitor, two competitors, it depends on the number of parties that are running at the state level. So the loser of the direct election can still enter the parliament via party lists. Let me explain this once again. So this is the basic setting that we need for hopefully causal identification. So say you have four parties, okay, and party A, say it's the dominant party. It's supposed that they really receive 50% of the second votes, okay, and that they also receive 50% of the first votes, so they will have plurality for all their candidates, okay. They will send 5 direct candidates to national parliament, okay. This is a state, suppose it's a state with 5 districts, okay. And in each of the districts, party A receives a plurality, okay, and it has its 5 direct candidates there. Party B receives 30% of second votes, loses all direct competitions, okay, but it can still send 3 persons to parliament, okay. Suppose Party B has one competitor against Party A in this district, another one here, etc. So they can enter, okay? Party C receives 10%, Party 4 also 10%. It's depending on where the direct candidates that lost ran, they enter parliament. And you see here in the end, it's just geometric. You have in District 4 just 1 representative, whereas in District 1 you have 3 representatives. The actual data set looks as follows. In roughly 30% of constituencies, we have only 1 legislator, so no additional legislators. In roughly 50% we have precisely 2 representatives in federal parliament, and then it goes on. Okay, so we remain between 1 to 3 additional legislators usually. What are the results? Well, very quickly, just what you see here is purely descriptive statistics, but it's nice. You see here, if there is no additional legislators, there are fewer federal civil servants in these constituencies. If you have exactly 1, if you have more than 1 additional legislators, you have more federal civil servants in these constituencies. We can go on, then we translate it to an empirical setting, and apply econometrics on that stuff. I don't want to highlight a lot here, so we do a numerous robustness test, etc. But throughout all estimates, we find relatively precisely estimated coefficients, and it's always in the ballpark of roughly 34 additional federal civil servants that you get. And we control, just want to highlight that, we control for the constituency being the constituency, so we employ so-called fixed effects as standard here. We then do numerous robustness tests. We do placebo tests, for example. So a placebo test would be having additional federal legislators does not increase the number of statewide civil servants, because that's decided by the state and by the federal. Okay. We do also numerous refinements, etc. For example, more experienced legislators are able to attract a bit more resources, whereas the younger ones don't. And if there is more competition, then competition between larger parties, then we also find that these constituencies attract more resources. And conclusions. Conclusions are always difficult to some extent. I think we find relatively clear evidence that more legislators lead to more federal resources for their constituents. Normative implications are difficult. To some extent, the commons are overused, as we know. But then again, that's what you want to some extent from the system. So you want that these people also take care of their constituency. That's why you have mixed electoral system. And finally, for political scientists in here, there is a large literature on contamination effects of electoral systems, because some people have tried to use mixed electoral system in order to identify effects of pure electoral systems. And here you see that you can leverage such contamination effects to your advantage, because indeed there is contamination, meaning that the party elected legislators behave similarly as directly elected legislators. So it's not ideal for the other literature to use mixed electoral system. You have to stick with yourself. I think we are quite good at that. Thanks a lot, and I'm really looking forward to questions, comments, suggestions. That's
You should go. I think you were the first one to raise your
Right. So thank you for the inspirational presentation. I have a question regarding the randomness, which is a prerequisite of your study setting. So if I understand correctly, this is like a sort of natural experiment study, and the prerequisite of the study is the mixed electoral system, which allows the district magnitude varies exogenously, right? So my question is, you only showed us the proportion of having excessive or extra numbers of candidates in different districts, but I'm not quite sure how does that support your assumption of randomness. For example, is it okay to assume the number of candidates in different districts follow a chi-square distribution or Poisson distribution, that kind of randomness? Could you please elaborate that more?
Yeah. So, I mean, it's not. We would like to call it a natural experiment, of course, but it's not a full natural experiment. The only thing is that you can't predict in advance how many legislators a certain constituency will have. It will be at most the number of parties that enter parliament, and it will always be one. But in between, from the point of view of a constituency, and also quite likely from the point of view of a party, you cannot predict. So in that sense, you know that you have one, but you can't be sure from the constituency point of view that you have 2 or 3. And in that sense, the number is exogenous.
Thank you.
Okay. Jessica, you are next, and then Mike, I guess.
So I thought that was a really cool way to think about using the mixed system. I wanted to address some of your requests at the beginning of the paper. One had to do with the fact that the original 1/n paper, right, by Weingast, Chefs, and Johnson, was really about projects, right? It was about specifically I say this as if I went and reviewed the paper before, so it's not that easy to call them mine. But it was about infrastructure projects. It was about public works projects. And you sort of have a brief paragraph in your paper about why you can use public civil servants as a way of thinking about distributive pork barrel spending. But I would love to hear more, because it seems to me that those things might operate a little bit differently. And so one way to get at that one might be just to sort of unpack a little bit more clearly exactly the mechanism by which you imagine, right, the 1/n operating in Germany, particularly with, you said there's like sort of ad campaigns and things like that, but this might be also an area to sort of extend the framing of this, right? Is this similar to, or is it somehow a different statement than specifically public works projects as we tend to think of them? And relatedly, what does that say about exactly how we think about both the party candidates' incentive at the district level, and then what the constituent actually expects out of them, given sort of that way of thinking about it?
That's very helpful. Thank you very much indeed. So we are using the number of employees that there are, and we are not directly using project resources, etc. This is due to data limitations that we unfortunately face here. So we tried to look at infrastructure reports, but it's just not really working. Plus, these infrastructure projects really take a lot of time to realize in relatively democratic societies. So I think it's not. Plus, you don't even know nowadays, at least, whether people really whether the locals really want road construction or not. So this is part is more limited. But I think you're precisely right. We should expand a bit on that and explain it better. And
I think there's an opportunity, like a positive opportunity there, right?
Exactly. What we plan to do and what we have not done yet sufficiently is we plan to talk to some legislators.
Would be good.
So we have some friends that will explain us precisely. No, really, how it's working, because it's not so direct.
That was one of the questions I wanted to ask. So I'm glad Jessica said that. So I go on to my second question, which really is kind of the nature of representation here in this system, and how the elected candidates see it and how the voters see these things. So if I understand what you're saying correctly, there's the proportionality for these results are applied to the state as a whole, not to the country. So nothing outside that state applies. It's a matter, and so the 10 that the district had in your example, the state had in your example, was set by some other constitutional sort of arrangement. And so the parties, however, have, I presume, some sort of national organization that unites party members in different states as well as different districts. Okay, so if I'm a member of the party list who gets elected because I was on the party list, not because I won the election, is my primary allegiance to the party
Yeah.
or to the district
Yeah.
or to the state that I'm living in? And it seems to me that you've tacked on to a variable that would be their primary interest might be themselves because they need a lot of assistance to sort of run these ad campaigns and stuff like that. So it's just simply a matter of that individual needing additional support and not really tying into projects or how many projects come in. And what's missing here is how all this fits into the party politics in Germany and district differences. And, you know, so I guess it's also sort of how, to what extent are the districts within these states different in their ideological orientation or their preferences for public works or environmental protection versus business improvement and all of that. So I guess if you just talk about how this relates to the national party system and to how the individual voters see what they're voting for when they vote in these elections. I know there's a lot tacked into that, but.
No, it's very good. It's very helpful too. So, of course, constituencies are different from each other, and states are different. If you have followed perhaps the last election, or if you have read the international news media, you may have heard that, especially in Eastern Germany, right-wing parties, or the new right-wing party is comparatively strong, whereas in the west of Germany you have a relatively strong Green party, so there are differences. So as far as time constant differences are concerned, these are captured in our setting by constituency fixed effects. If there is a change within the constituency over time, we do not fully capture it, apart from the additional control variables that we enter, such as demographic information, etc. So I think we take account of that, but as good as the econometric setting allows us to do that. Then it's a very important question that you raise regarding the allegiance that you have as a politician, and also the mode of representation. So we decided against discussions to a large extent the mode of representation between trustee and delegate, because we think we simply can't add to that important discussion. Plus, having observational data only, it is virtually impossible to distinguish between the two modes of representation. So I don't think we can add anything to this important debate. So we abstain from it. Regarding allegiance, that's a difficult question, an important one. So what I can tell you definitely is, if you are a directly elected candidate, then you are a bit freer from your party. So you observe that these tend to be the people who deviate a bit more, although party loyalty is extremely high in Germany, and party pressure and party control is also extremely high. So there is even what they call the obligation to vote with your party, and only in certain roll calls, the chancellor, the head of the party, will say, okay, you are free to vote according to your conscience, which is perhaps strange for some international audience. But at the same time, there is loyalty also, not so much to the state, I would say, but to some extent to the constituency, and you see punishment if the politicians are not present in the districts. So there is a nice example from a representative for the Green Party running in the state of Bremen, and she got pressure from her constituents that she was never present in Bremen, and then actually the party decided not to put her well on the list. So there are numerous complex interactions going on, but there is definitely an incentive, and this is also confirmed by the friends of other politicians. We know that especially as a directly elected candidate, you try to be a bit more in your constituency. And I mean, these are now one conservative, so Christian Democrat would tell me, you know, I also want to escape the bubble in Berlin. So it's nice. It's nice to go home. Then again, a green representative would tell you that precisely that bubble is enjoyable. You know, yeah, you have it all. But I think there are allegiances to the party and to the constituency for both types of representatives. Meaning that's what you would expect from the mixed electoral system, and that's where I think we leverage that to some extent, so it's not a disadvantage to us, but of course we don't understand again the full mechanism of how these allegiances really work.
Could I quick follow-up?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, that's all makes perfect sense, but I wonder then, have you looked at whether these candidates elected directly behave differently from the candidates elected in your party
We are
list?
doing that.
For example, it would seem to me that, like you said, someone who's elected directly has to have more connection to their district than the others. The members who are run through the party, they're clearly can be more dependent on the party for assistance and providing advertising and stuff like that. So do these party list members who are added to a district bring as many new civil servants or assistants or people in their office on their website as do these ones who tend to get elected directly? Those are the ones who are going to be running these massive local campaigns, telling everybody all the time all the things that they're involved in, whereas the other ones are going to be more willing to let the party run the campaigns for them. So you've got an opportunity, I think, to see here that if these individuals differ in the level of civil society within a district or within a state. So just a suggestion.
Yes, that's a very nice suggestion. Yes, please.
Thank you for this great paper and presentation. For me, it's a great introduction to the German election system because I'm not familiar with it at all. I have maybe a very
You're the only one.
rudimentary question and one comment. So first question is, actually, how do the parties decide at the federal level the kind of representation percentage of each party? Is it dependent on the first tier election, the direct voting system, based on the candidates and the parties that they're registered in? That's my first question. Second, federal public servants considered federal resources as an outcome of the federal legislators per one additional, as you mentioned, one additional legislature equals 34 public servants in effect, right? So are the servants, so are the job positions per se and federal resource or financial and other resources an outcome of more public servants working on it? And then the third question is, the randomness is really, I think, a very innovative point of your paper. My question is it deliberately random in the sense that I would doubt that, or is it simply because it's numerically speaking sort of an inevitable result because you've got 209 constituencies and you have, was it 709 parliament seats? So that's my third question. And my comment is going to the paragraph you wrote at the beginning of your paper. If I have any suggestions to frame the results, I think the paper, your research is really methodologically innovative, and so maybe you sort of like give more emphasis on the methodological design. I think it's really cool that you use this phenomena of the randomness to tease out the exogenous variables that you identified. But maybe power represented by additional federal legislators and their correlation to more resources is not that, I mean, we would expect more power would lead to more shares of resources, right? That's my comment.
Thank you very much for the comments. These are helpful. Perhaps if you think that more legislators is more power, then you are right. There is some literature that would argue against that because if you have more legislators, then also responsibility is diffused. So we don't need to work so hard anymore because it has always been the other guy who should have worked for the constituency. So it's not necessarily the case. Regarding your question on randomness, I don't know. The system was not designed to be deliberately random, but it's a natural consequence of how the system was designed that you get in some randomness. You have 299 districts, and then the remaining seats have to be filled up with some additional subtleties. And in order to achieve rough proportionality overall, you need to come up with additional legislators somewhere. And this distribution of the legislator, that is then quasi-random. Regarding financial resources, I mean, if you get additional federal civil servants, this is of course related to federal resources that are flowing to these constituencies, to these districts. So a very concrete example, even from the city where I'm currently working in Bayreuth. So the directly elected legislator there would argue, oh, actually last year I have ensured that the federal police office in my district will get an additional 30 police officers, okay? But by the way, well, this she didn't say, but it's not us that are paying, but it's federal government that is paying, okay? So this is good for us, by the way, because the others are paying. So how do parties decide? So there are national parties. There is one regional party too, which is very strong, especially in the state of Bavaria. The parties, it depends a bit. The parties decide at the state level, but there is also local opinions and local influence, but also influence of the youth wing. Some parties have self-imposed quotas regarding women and men. For example, the Green Party has an explicit quota on its party list. So usually they don't win many direct mandates nationally, perhaps 3 or 4, something like that. But on their party list, you have a quota system for in each state, where the first position has to be a woman, the second position man, and then it goes like simple. So there are numerous influences there, which means, again, for us, that's okay. It's nice because it introduces this additional element of randomness, of exogeneity. So it's virtually impossible to predict the number of legislators per district. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
My pleasure.
So this was a fun paper to read, so thank you. My question, I have 2 questions, but they're wrapped up on the same kind of idea, but it's that of time. So just within an election, and this might just be my ignorance of the German system shining through, but within an election, can you maybe unpack the sequence of events when it comes to the first choice, and then how the parties does it all happen at once, or does the distribution of election outcomes, does that inform party selection, and might there be some politicking between parties that kind of determines kind of how the second votes get unfolded? And then the second comment I had was more across your sample, and the use of federal civil servants, going back to Jessica's point. It seemed like an odd outcome because those seem like very sticky types of positions that aren't going to change much. But perhaps that actually helps with your argument, because it's unlikely to change, right? Because they are sticky. The CDC is always going to be in Atlanta regardless of the congressional seat there or the governorship. But what happens when you lose an additional legislator? Instead of just the treatment being binary, it seems you actually have 3 types of outcomes. The one, you gain some, but you also lose some. So I was wondering, if you lose additional legislators, does that mean you lose federal servants?
Yeah, it does.
So those are my kind of questions about time, and maybe thinking about that a little bit more.
So this is a very important comment because there we have to improve it. Doesn't seem to be fully clear. So the voting works the following way: that you get a ballot, and on this ballot you have a number of direct candidates. You tick off one of these direct candidates, and on the very same ballot, so on the left you have the direct candidates, and on the right you have the parties. And at the same time you choose also the parties. There has been in the past not directly bickering, but of course the second vote is the important one in the end at the national level and for parties, because it ensures how well they are represented in federal parliament. So some parties would try to convince voters to give them the second vote. So say the Liberal Party would argue, well, you can vote for the direct candidate of the Conservative Party, but give us the second vote, okay? Which in the end would lead the Conservative Party actually to lose something, because the second vote is the one that is counted, but you do it at the same time. So there is no direct strategy during the election or after that.
I meant more for the parties. How do they decide when they're allocating their second choice across the districts? Do they already know the outcomes of the first choice votes?
No, they don't.
Oh, okay.
They don't.
So it all
It's
kind of
all-
is like set beforehand.
Yeah,
Oh,
they don't.
interesting.
It's once you have voted, then it's distributed through a complicated formula. The direct candidates are elected, and the list candidates they then come in to ensure proportionality. You may have so-called overhang mandates, compensation mandates, etc. Say, for example, if a party wins in a state all direct candidates, but only achieves for each direct candidate 33%, because there are numerous parties. And also in the statewide election for the second vote, they have achieved 33%. Then the other parties will get additional seats because, okay.
Yeah, I get
So
it.
these are overhanging compensation mandates, and there are other subtleties. They are again adding to the randomness, but there is no strategy once the election has happened. Okay, then the positions are sticky. Yeah, where exactly? So it's symmetric, the effect, and I think a lot of the effect that we are exploring is actually coming the following way. It's not that one additional legislator gives you 35 additional federal civil servants, but it's if you lose a legislator, okay, then over time there is one person less fighting for you, and you lose over time additional the federal. So it goes in both directions. Again, from the home city, we have I think 4 legislators that are representing the district of Bayreuth. If 1 or 2 were lost, then it is quite likely that over some time period also some legislators will be lost. So they are fighting to keep, for example, the police office, or they are fighting to keep to some extent the military personnel, etc., in their district. So it's also not to lose, not only to win additional. So it goes in both directions, yes.
Bob, I think.
So Tony actually anticipated my question. Did you have my budgeting seminar, by the way?
Yeah,
Yes, you weren't?
No, just well read.
How you are next time. You must be innate intelligence. So I'm a budgeting guy, study budgeting and finance and governance, and I was just thinking about the problem of maybe using as dependent variable the amount of federal budget resources allocated to a given state or district within a state. That gets to be very tricky. There's a lot of inertia in budgets, you know, the stickiness you were talking about earlier, and a lot of lags, which you also alluded to, David. Rarely do you see a major lurch forward, so change tends to be incremental, but it is measurable, you know. And so I was thinking here how to be able to check for a change in budget resource. It may be present, but subtle. You know, in other words, you might not find an absolute change in a given year that appears to be significant, but it could be sort of below the surface, looking at, let's say, the federal expenditures that are coming into a district as a proportion of the federal revenues that are moving out of the district. You may find that you're net importers and net exporters of federal resources. As a consequence, the change, marginal changes in that ratio over time might be very significant, you know, and especially if you look at it with a little bit of a lag, that might pick it up for you. So if you looked at it sort of in input-output terms, in the relationship of a given state with the federal government, you know, you might find that there's an awful lot going on there that's just below the surface. But you open up a Pandora's box of problems when you start looking at federal budget dollars because of that, the problem of inertia and lag effect. So I wanted to caution you, but also say it can be very exciting.
We would love to do that, to look at actual monetary resources, but we don't have the data and it's not available. So you can only rely on these proxies. That's why we use number of federal civil servants as a proxy for federal resources in the end. Regarding inertia, perhaps we have a small test for that. So what we find is that legislators, constituencies with legislators, with additional legislators that are new to parliament, they don't receive additional federal civil servants. So it's rather the guys that have already been in parliament, they first know how to do it, and secondly, may take some time.
Returns to seniority.
Seniority, exactly. We find some returns to seniority, exactly. We are careful with it because it's a small effect, but it is visible in the data. Yeah. Very nice.
So, David, thank you so much. I was running for these recent elections, and so it made me think about quite a few things in a new way. So thank you. I have a number of questions. The first one: why do you start in 1998? Is it to escape the transition mess, or is it just because of data?
It's because of data, yeah.
Because of data. And my next question is, wouldn't it be perhaps wiser to end, even though you lose data, of course, in 2013?
Okay.
Because in 2013, this new party came into parliament. Alternative for Germany, and most MPs, of course, are in very different positions since they're in sort of a fundamental opposition role, so they wouldn't matter so much. And of course, on top of that, you have, because of them and because of some other effects, the explosion of the Bundestag, which you mentioned.
Yes.
I don't know if you gain more by adding 2017, or if you get somewhat less vagueness and ambivalence by leaving it out.
I think we have tried it. So we have tried to estimate separate legislative periods, and we get the same results. So I would add it, and I would also, to answer quickly, we have legislature fixed effect. So I think that should be taken into account. Of course, if you say correctly that the whole discussion in the Bundestag, etc., is changing, then we don't have it full insight. But I think it works in both ways. Yeah.
So my next question is, I was thinking how those lists come into existence, like checking out my own political memory. And I have a sense that it's quite often that the first positions are distributed on a sort of a metropolitan area effect, so the large districts within a state would gain more seats also for the federal list. So would it make sense to control for distance from the capital, or the size of, probably you've done that, I don't know, but I don't think it's just random.
Yeah,
right?
it's done. Right. It's done. You are perfectly right. So we do it. We do it in several ways. One is that we get rid in the sample of larger cities, even larger cities with more than 100,000 inhabitants, etc. So we are aware of this fact, and also that some legislators may want to live in cities and run in cities. So you have selection going there in both directions. If we get them, so the selection would would make our results regarding the number of legislators non-random anymore. If we get rid of it, we get still the same results. So yeah.
My next question is just briefly adding to the inertia point. So perhaps there could be also something like network externalities involved, saying that the more civil servants you have in a region, like the Mateos Principis Matthew effect, the more you get, right? So the more attractive that place becomes. And my final one is if it would make sense to control for key federal ministers, so not just the parties who are running a coalition, but people like the Minister of Transportation, Minister of Law, Minister of Social Affairs, because those are the people who are actually distributing those funds. So Bavaria being oversupplied with public servants could be directly related to the fact that the Minister of Transportation for decades on end has been from that party, right? So would that make sense, like to look at individual key ministers who send the money around?
Very good. Thank you very much. So we did not look at the Matthew effect, but we have to think about it. I think it's a very good idea. We didn't directly look at federal ministers, but we looked at whether the politicians that were elected had different positions either in the party, in the state already, and whether they are in certain committees, etc. So yeah, we don't find anything that changes our insight. There are relatively few federal ministers that really distribute the money, so empirically I think we can't look at it. The case that Bavaria gets a lot of money and a lot of civil servants, especially regarding road construction, etc., seems to be that Bavaria is one of the few states that has the capacity, administrative capacity to get that money. Because it's done by the state, but it's paid paid federally, and you need to set up the administration. And interestingly, although Germany is highly sophisticated regarding administration, there's only one state that seems to be able to do that.
But I was also thinking of things like Max-Planck institutes and things like that, which are also discretionary decisions.
Yes. Good. This is very good. Yep. That's very good.
So given that we have a long queue here, and I will collect a couple of questions here. So I think, can you start? I think you.
I just have one short clarification. Is the population per district the same or
Yes,
not?
roughly the same. Not perfectly, but that's why you have changes in the borders. So.
But for lot, it's better use the per servant per population.
Yeah. So as the population is roughly the same, we are fine with both, and that's written in the paper. But very important question, yes.
Yeah. So for your first question here, you wanted to know if the explanation of the electoral system was clear. For the most part, it is. But I do have one question. So I'm coming from the Russian context. When I hear about proportional representation, I'm thinking of sublists. Does the German electoral system use these regional sublists when we're talking about party lists? So in the Russian system, it's not just, so say United Russia wins 400 seats. It's not just United Russia just bestows down one national list. They have sub-lists.
Yes.
Depending on how many votes a region delivers to that party, they get kind of the share of the party's broader winnings. And what happens then is that the number of seats you receive isn't so random. At least in the Russian context, obviously the Russian context is significantly less democratic, but what these regional elites kind of figure out is that if I can deliver more votes to United Russia, who has the most seats to give out, I can get more representatives. And there's actually evidence of them learning this over time.
Okay, interesting. Yeah.
And so that might need to be explained, especially for people who are wondering about how random this allocation is.
That's very good.
So Scott, Gerhard, and Bill, in that order, could you
Yes, very
go?
brief.
So we give also time for wrap up today.
No, and this was great, David, as people have said, I really enjoyed it. And I learned a few things, more than a few. Just page 24, you talk about how actually, and this is news to me as well, mixed member electoral systems exist around the world, very plentiful, and I'm just wondering, maybe you could say a few words about other examples of this, which kind of leads us into kind of policy impacts, and since that's one thing the workshop has been focused on historically, putting on a policy hat, does this augur for reforming some of these, mixed member electoral systems in some way, or are there other benefits maybe that are worthwhile perhaps pointing to in the conclusion that outweigh maybe some of these perceived drawbacks? And for that matter, do other countries do this a bit differently? Could Germany learn from some of those examples as well? So just a few thoughts.
Gerhard, you want to?
So I should know this, but I can't have my mind around this. Is 35 extra civil servants a big number or a small number? I imagine in a backwater like Heidenheim, which I know well, it should be big, but then in Munich or the Ruhrgebiet, it's probably pretty small. So it would have been nice to have a distribution of the extra elements in map. I guess in some fields people do maps of where are all these extra people, and it's dark if you get a lot of extra people, and not so dark if it's negative, or that would be useful. The other thing that came to my mind is, I think you treat each electoral district as a unit of observation.
Yes.
So you're ruling out any kind of spatial autocorrelation like neighboring effects. I think in this country, you would think that the legislators from Indiana kind of work together for the 9 different districts. And then if it's offices, if these positions are affiliated with offices, they could be affiliated with an environmental office, then you have the whole Ruhrgebiet hanging together, you have the Rhine River hanging together. So it's not clear if you could, well, I imagine you could do some more work in this dimension.
Bill, do you want to?
Yeah, my question isn't about, and maybe this will be good to come at toward the end. Not about the findings, the data or the methods, but about the framing. Given, I just want to invite you in light of the discussion here today to think out loud with us about the ways in which this is and isn't a commons. If my district gains civil servants and Angie's district loses civil servants, what's being overexploited here? I mean, it sounds more like this is a distribution and a redistribution within the allocation of a resource rather than sort of the overexploitation of a resource or the sort of things that we typically think about, where everybody tries to get something for their constituency, and as a result there's some limited resource that gets exhausted somehow.
But so I guess if you think of the upside being asymmetric from the downside, that would tell you about how the resource might be expanded or not, right? If it's a fixed resource, you would think there's some symmetry between the upside and the downside, then you can presumably figure out if the upside is different from the downside on average.
But this, I agree, and part of what stimulated the question was some of the questions asked today and the responses to some of those questions. If you can have parties that gain seats and they don't get any more civil servants for having gained seats, or you have junior legislators who gain a seat, but because they're junior legislators, they don't get more civil servants, or if you can have parties that lose seats and their districts lose civil servants, in what respects is this a common pool resource issue as opposed to just a distributional issue?
Some people want to jump on this. Try to be fast, but please jump and then
so there's a really good article in AJPS. It uses an error correction model that kind of gets to this idea of when the intervention, how quickly does it take effect and how permanent is it? Is this an instantaneous and short-lived, or is this a gradual and permanent effect of these extra seats?
That's good.
So it's kind of a way to think about the long-term effects of maybe having an additional seat.
go
Yeah,
on,
I have
Sean.
a comment. I wonder if there's a pattern for these regions or states getting less federal representations in general, and then overall, in the long term, do they develop more self-organized initiatives? Do they have a more liberal economy in the state? I'm just thinking, regardless of the context, obviously. And then others will get more federal resources will eventually become more like state-dependent or state-dominant. That's my question.
Well,
Sum that up.
Thinking out loud.
You got 5 minutes, go. Now you're looking at a limited resource.
I'm still relatively young, so look at that, perhaps. Thank you very much. Coming to you, Bill, directly. Well, of course, you could see it to some extent as a zero-sum game. What I win, you lose, etc. At the same time, it is in the literature perhaps wrongly framed as a fiscal commons. Okay,
Sure.
so you should perhaps rethink that. For a specific this could be interesting. I have to think about it a little more. It would be nice to say the whole literature uses the term wrongly, actually.
There's your breakthrough.
As the German federal parliament is constantly increasing in its size due to a system which is very weird to some extent, the problem becomes a bit larger. So the total budget is increasing, but then still, of course, within the country, it's just a redistribution. So what Bavaria wins, this is what other states are losing. But of course, any asymmetric distribution of resources is also often perceived as a problem. Perhaps we should.
Sure.
So, but it's a very, very good
It has
idea.
all kinds of potential fairness issues.
Perhaps-
I just wasn't sure there was a
Perhaps
resource
Barry
exploitation
Weingast
issue.
was wrong at calling it fiscal commons. Yes. Yeah, is it big or small? Gerhard, yes, it's a very. So to some extent, I also thought it was rather small. Then again, if you think it's 0.62 additional civil servants per 1,000 people, it's not too small. But of course, it's not the largest issue in the world. As so often, the economists have to be humble. There are numerous things which are.
No, I thought everyone can learn from this.
The way you look at
It is a very so. It is not huge, I would say, but it's a very precisely identified effect which remains remarkable constant throughout everything that we are doing, and which corresponds nicely to what anecdotes, etc., tell us. But it's not a world changer in that sense. Yes, probably as it serves as a proxy for other resources that may be linked to it, the total effect would be larger. So it's quite interesting that we observe it for a relatively sticky factor, mainly employees. So you would think that if there are other resources to be redistributed, which there are, but which you can't measure, that the results would get even larger. So there are mixed electoral systems around the world. For example, in Estonia, you have very strange electoral systems which change relatively constantly. In Italy and Greece, etc., where you get bonus seats, which are then allocated to the parties that win. I think the main message that you can learn from our paper is that one has to be very careful when analyzing mixed electoral systems. So we try to leverage it to our advantage. But the mixed electoral system is really different to pure electoral system as you would have in the United States, where you have only the first past the post system, or the Westminster system, where you have only first past the post again, and a proportional system, a purely proportional system, as you have, for example, in Switzerland at the National Council. So, so what people did in the past and are still doing is that they think, oh, if I have a mixed electoral system, then I have plurality elected candidates and I have proportionally elected candidates, okay, and then I can try to learn something for the pure systems. But this is not the case, as we would argue. So it's really different, and you have to use it you can sometimes use it to your own advantage, but not to. So this is not a message that we want to send. Which electoral system is better or worse? It's simply, if you elect so the message would be for the United States: if you elect 5 senators instead of 2, then be prepared that it will become more expensive, which is also something relevant.
Well, you managed to handle the wave of questions.
Yes,
I'm impressed.
I'm not German, but I'm Austrian, so I try to stick to time too.
And with humor. Okay, David, thank you very much.
Hope to be back soon.
That's right. And a cookout reminder for Wednesday, right? Wednesday noon to 2, we have our cookout here at the workshop. And then there's an affiliate meeting right before that, if you'd like to come to that too. So, okay.
Can I make an announcement real quick?
Yeah, of course.
The economics department is hosting Jonathan Eaton Thursday night for the Roy Gardner lecture.
Oh, great.
He will talk about the knowledge economy, whatever that might be. So
Come get some
you all
knowledge.
are invited, and I'll see if I can send the staff here an announcement today. So
Yeah.
That would be good,
Yes.
that would
Yeah,
be
the where and
good.
the when would be great.
Actually, can I make an announcement?
Sure, please. Yeah.
The Center for 18th Century Studies every year gives a prize for the best book in 18th century studies.
Oh, yeah.
And this year, the book is Calculated Values, Finance, Politics, and the Quantitative Age,
Oh,
which is a study of how numbers became politically important
how
in
interesting.
Britain
Yeah.
from about the 1680s to the 1720s.
Yeah.
One of the chapters is a fascinating study of the debate on how much Scotland had to be paid in compensation in order to join the Union in 1707. Yeah.
Oh, that would be
So,
Undervaluation.
that's right. So
Rip from the
all of
headlines,
these
yeah.
fascinating episodes that we've completely lost track of.
Yeah.
The author will be here. He's in science and technology studies at MIT,
Oh, great.
and actually has a background working in some private equity firm before he went to graduate school. And so the event is from 4 to 6 on Friday, September 27th, in the
Fantastic.
Lilly Library.
Oh, great.
We'll have a pop-up exhibition of some of the sources that he used,
Yeah, yeah.
and a little reception, and then formal program starting at 4:30. So
Fantastic.
everybo's welcome, please come.
That sounds really good.
And
And I have
you.
copies of the book at a significant discount.
Yes.
How much of
Can you
it?
send out an email?
Yeah, Rebecca, if you want to let us know.
Okay,
Yeah, yeah,
let's
yeah, yeah.
organize,
Yeah,
yeah, let's
yeah, yeah.
organize these two together, we'll get a push out.
Okay.
Yeah, that's brilliant.
That sounds great.
Okay.
Anybody else?
More announcements?
Excellent. Thanks again, David. That was awesome.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, last round, yeah.
I'm sorry.
More time.